So apparently mages are squishy now. This is a point of debate. Mages are very controversial, and after reading a lot of takes on specific classes being squishier than others, I decided to do some research and see if I can prove anything with numbers. Now the big question is, what makes a class tanky or squishy? And it's not something with one answer. The best criteria I could come up with is this: the base health and damage reduction of a class, the frequency in which defensives can be used, the strength of those defensives, and the self-healing of a class, both incidental and intentional. So I went through every class in the game and mapped out their base HP and base DR. Some classes have pretty big gaps between hero talents, so I put every hero talent here. I excluded some select defensive talents that were not being run in logs. I also didn't count physical DR because most important damage is magical and armor exists anyways. Some DR effects did not have 100% uptime, so I added them as an estimate average. And of course, HP and DR do not have the exact same value, and DR does diminish, but as these numbers are small, they are mostly comparable and accurate, and I wanted them to be simple. And to make this even simpler, I just combined every hero tree per spec and gave a bit of an average on those that had big gaps, and here is the graph on base survivability by class. But after I made this, Blizzard buffed Shaman defenses by a very nice 5% HP and 2% DR, bringing the actual graph to look like this. At the bottom, you have Mage and Rogue as classes that traditionally have a lot of defensives available but are very weak defensively if you misuse them. Then there is Windwalker and Shadow Priest who don't really have those defenses available and still have weak passive DR. You have Shaman and Hunter who used to be weak defensively but after repeated buffs are very strong at base level. And then there are the specs like Ret, Warlock and DK who essentially are just running around with a permanent wall. So to an untrained individual, this would be a reasonable metric to judge how tanky a class is. But defensives exist and some classes have a lot more than others. Now an individual defensive profile is very situational. A Shaman, for example, can be very strong against damage events 90 seconds apart but crumble when the events become 80 seconds apart. To gather data for this, I decided to treat this like a sim. I took the cumulative uptime of defensives across a 5-minute period for each class and also the amount of individual defenses pressed in a 5-minute period. I counted any defensive that gives 15% or more health or DR. I also counted AoE cooldowns like Zephyr. I counted heals and absorbs as defenses here and gave a value where 20% health equals to 1 second. For total duration, the defensive cooldown kings are rogues, with Feint being such a short cooldown that it can cover virtually any damage event. Then there is druids, who have a new 30% health buff with 20 second duration on Heart of the Wild. Classes with the lowest defensive uptime are Mage and Shadow Priest, with Shaman also down there if you were to not count Earth Ellie. Classes with high uptimes in this category would feel stronger in consistent rot fights. If we look at the total amount of defensive pressed in a 5-minute period, this does favour Mage, as Mage can cover virtually every damage event with a weak defensive. Classes with multiple short cooldowns are very strong in this category, while classes that have only 1 or 2 long cooldown defensives like Shaman or Demon Hunter are losing here. Any encounter with many different damage events will feel very scary for the classes with less defensives in this category. And then I took the uptime on defensives in a 1-minute period. This could be a very difficult pull, like the first pull of Winter on Aspire. This favours classes with charges or long cooldowns on the defensives. Also, Shaman is probably a bit overrepresented because I am counting Earth Ellie. Now, of course, these metrics will not show the full picture because some specs with no defensive are stronger than specs with defensives up. Like DK does not look impressive on these charts. I made some scatter plots with these metrics plotted against the base DR of classes. The further a spec is in the bottom left, the weaker it is in the given scenario. Windwalker and Shadow are specs that are consistently weak in all these metrics. Now you also have to consider the strength of a defensive. A percentage damage reduction has an exponential effect on your effective health. This is the EHP formula. A 20% defensive gives 25% EHP, a 40% defensive gives 66% EHP, and if you had a 60% defensive, it would give you 150% more EHP. If you have played classes with a 20% DR, you would notice a very big difference between that and a 40% DR because of this EHP. This does not apply to 2 individual effects. For example, 2 20% DRs would diminish each other to a 36% DR. Now this matters a lot for dot events, where you're constantly taking damage and need a lot of healing. It would matter a lot for one-shots if we were in Dragonflight, because back then every dungeon had multiple one-shot bosses with insane overkills. But Blizzard has moved away from that design, and there are like 2 total situations in Midnight where you will ever get one shot, and the overkill is pretty small. Half of the classes in the game are virtually immune to one-shots, and the other half could easily live with maybe one external thrown in. And then there is the metric of self-healing. This is just the generic statistics graph for healing done in beta dungeons. A lot of classes have different profiles of self-healing. Demon Hunters and Warlocks have a lot of leech, Shadow Priests do a lot of off-healing. There are a lot of classes that just have a strong hero talent that gives an absorb or heal, such as Marksmanship Hunter. Now this graph doesn't show off-healing, which is a very mixed bag. All off-heals were nerfed baseline going into the stat squish, and only some of them have been buffed back up. Vivify is kinda useless. Healing Surge was buffed then nerfed. Overall, off healing is kinda weak now. So now we have our metrics, let's try and rank the classes. I will be bringing out the tier list. First, we have Warrior, a spec with high stamina and DR. Reflect on a very short cooldown allows you to further reduce almost any damage event. Their self-healing is strong both actively and passively. The caveats are that Arms is weaker defensively and Fury loses damage to take and rage regen. Ret Paladin is another plate class with high DR and good defensives, although they can run thin and might not be able to defensive every mechanic. Warlocks have a high base DR, high leech, and frequent defensives. One concern about Warlocks is that their wall is a long cooldown, so most of their defensives are in absorbs and healing. Hunters also now have high base DR with a lot of defensive options available. Hunter has the most individual defensive cooldowns of any class. Now getting into classes with less base DR, we have Demon Hunter, which only really has 2 charges of Blur. Demon Hunter does have a lot of leech though, so it is very strong against any form of rot. Next we have Evoker, which is defensively strong in Obsidian Scales, but after using both charges it doesn't have much left. Note they did add a massive stagger to Deep Breath this expansion, but I'm not sure how usable it is as a defensive. Druids have moderate base DR, but now they have a lot of defenses with a new long duration HP buff from Heart of the Wild, and also the classic ability to go bear form at any point in time. Shamans were previously defensively weak, but they got a buff to their base DR. They are now as tanky at base as the strongest specs, but Shaman defensives are still very lacking with little ability to cover frequent damage events. Shadow Priest is a spec that has low base DR and quite weak defensives. Its only real strengths is its self-healing and group healing, and that it can flash fade on demand, although flash heal must be used proactively. And I think the weakest class defensively is probably Windwalker Monk. This spec has low base DR and only 2 minute 30 defensives, one of which is just an absorb. Their leech is low and Vivify is quite weak. Back when Windwalker had dampen and diffuse, it could make up for this, but now its kit is a bit lacking. I have 2 classes left I didn't rank that I think require more skill to play defensively. Rogue has the strongest defensive cooldown of all, which is Feint, on top of an immunity and the choice between evasion as a DR or a cheat death. The only real concern for Rogue is an encounter that does constant ticking damage, not classified as AoE, in which Rogue's low base DR becomes a problem. And then the controversial class is Mage. Once considered to be a very tanky class, Mage lost 3 of its defensives this expansion and got no compensation in its base DR, which is only 4% magic DR and nothing else. Unlike other classes, Mage's only wall is on a 2 minute 30 cooldown and it lasts only 6 seconds, which will rarely cover an entire mechanic. However, Mage still has Barrier and Altar, which still have quite short cooldowns and can cover most damage events on a boss. I think Mage is very inconsistent in its defensive ability. On some encounters where Mage's cooldowns line up very well, I think Mage has no problem surviving, but on some consistent damage pulls or bosses, Mage can just end up falling flat. Also, Frost Mage has 2 charges of Barrier and Ice Cold, which allows it to be much more fluid in its defensive ability use and cover a lot more mechanics. I put it a tier above the other 2 Mage specs, on the same level as Shaman, which is its polar opposite class in terms of defensive profile. Of course, at the top of this list is Death Knight. This class is far above any other. Its base DR is comparable to other classes while they are in their biggest wall, and on top of that they have a defensives that completely nullifies a lot of mechanics and a group cooldown. If the DK is ever threatened, Death Strike is also just the strongest self-healing ability, and the class can be almost entirely self-sufficient as a DPS. This has greatly contributed to the class being a meta DPS for the entire previous expansion. And new in Midnight, Unholy DK has switched their Runeforge to the Rune of the Apocalypse, which grants a permanent 18% damage reduction effect on top of everything else they have. So this is my tier list for class defensives, but I wanted to sort them into a more categorized view, so I came up with these 5 categories with the worst on the bottom left and the best on the top right. In the bottom left, we have the weakest classes with low base DR and weak defensives. In the top left, we have Rogue and Frost Mage, which have low base DR but strong defensives. On the bottom right, we have classes that I would say have an average level of base DR or average defensives. And in the top right, we have classes with strong base DR and strong defensives. And in its own category is Death Knight. Now, am I trying to make a statement here? Not really. I don't think every class needs to have the same defensive profile or capabilities. I think it's good as an example that plate classes feel tankier, but I do think maybe the weakest classes could be thrown a bone like Shaman was.